This easy slip stitch pillow cover is knit using super bulky weight yarn. I'm using Lion Brand Woolies Thick and Quick color Fisherman. It's going to take 2 balls to make the pillow cover. The cover will fit a 14-inch square pillow form. The pattern instructions tell me I'll need a US size 13 9mm knitting needle or the size to obtain gauge. So of course I'm going to check my gauge first to make sure that this is the size needle that I need, and I'll make adjustments by changing my needle size if I need to once I do my gauge swatch. The first thing to do with any project is to knit a swatch to check your gauge. To knit a swatch, I'll cast on about 19 stitches using size 13 needles, these are 9mm needles, and work in my slip stitch pattern. I'll begin with a long tail cast on, so I'm going to leave a nice long tail about 3 times as long as the piece I'm going to knit, and this is a swatch, so I don't know, 15-18 inches long. I'll put the working yarn over my forefinger and the yarn tail over my thumb and hold them together in my hand like this, so that I have the strand running between my index finger and my thumb. With my right needle, I'll push down and then forward to create a loop on my thumb, and then come up from front to back through that loop, go around and grab the strand on my forefinger and bring it back through the loop on my thumb, and then I can drop the loop on my thumb. And I've created 2 stitches without using a slip knot. I'll cast on using the long tail cast on until I have 19 stitches. The 19 stitches is a multiple of 4 plus 3, which is what my slip stitch pattern calls for. I've done a long tail cast on, and I have the right side of my cast on here in my right hand. Of course, I have to turn to work the first row. The first row is a setup row. It's a wrong side row. The slip stitch pattern tells me to knit 3 and then purl 1, knit 3 across. So I'll purl 1 and then knit 3 and repeat those 4 stitches all the way across. If I hold the yarn in my left hand, that purl 1, knit 3 looks like this. So I finished my first row. I'm going to turn, and you can kind of see those bumps of where I have my knit stitches. Those are purl bumps, and there's where I did a purl. So you can see that there's a smooth stitch there every 4th stitch. Row 1 is a right side row, and it tells me to knit 3 and then slip 1 with yarn in back. The yarn is already in back because I'm knitting, so I'm going to slip 1, and I slip purlwise, so as if to purl, going into the front of the stitch from right to left or from back to front, and just slip that stitch off without knitting it. So I'll knit 3 and then repeat that across. So I'm going to slip 1 with yarn in back and knit 3. I'll show you what it looks like holding the yarn in the left hand. Slip 1, knit 3. Turn and work row 2, which is the same as our setup row. It's knit 3, purl 1. So I have to bring the yarn forward to purl it, and then back to knit 3. And here's where you can start to see the pattern develop and start reading your work instead of reading the pattern. You can see here that this is the stitch that I slipped before. On the other side I didn't work it, so I have that strand running across. That shows that that was the slip stitch on the other side, and it reminds me that I need to purl. So if I lose track of my pattern, I just know that I knit the stitches that were knit stitches, So I'm knitting the knits, knitting the stitches that were knits on the other side and look like pearls here. And then when I come to that slipped stitch, I'm going to purl it. Now if I get interrupted in my stitch pattern, it doesn't matter because I can just read my work. And that is really the key to being a good knitter, is to be able to see what's going on in your knitting as much as being able to read the pattern. Looking at the right side after I finished row 2, I can see the stitch pattern. Here I have the garter stitch rows. These 3 stitches are garter stitch, and these are the ones that are slipped on the right side rows and purled on the wrong side rows. So now I really don't need to read a pattern at all, but if I want to, I can continue working rows 1 and 2 reading the pattern, or I can just continue working rows 1 and 2 by looking at the fabric that I'm creating. So now I'm just going to keep going, repeating rows 1 and 2 until I have about 5 inches. Now that I've knit my swatch, it's time to measure my gauge. I'll just put it down on the table just the way it lands and put my ruler up here. I like to measure not from the very edge, but from the 1 inch mark, just in case this isn't printed quite right. And then I'm going to measure 4 inches. This pattern makes it pretty easy to measure because I have these slip stitch bands here, which I know that from the beginning here to the beginning here, the beginning of my stitch pattern is 4 stitches. So I can know that's 4, that's 8, and that's 12, but it doesn't quite reach. My 4 inches would be right here where the 5 is, 1, 2, 3, 4, but it looks like I have about another stitch there, so I'm going to call that 11 stitches over 4 inches. It might be easier to measure the back or the wrong side, but you have to be careful because while it looks like I could just measure here and count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. What's going on here? Because I'm only getting 9 stitches across here. I got 11 on the other side. What's happening is these slip stitches are not showing up on this side. They are hidden within the stitch pattern here. They're sitting up on top of the fabric, so you're not seeing it on this side. So if you're going to count on this side, you have to remember to add back in those slip stitches that aren't showing. So I'm going to call this 11 stitches equals 4 inches. And then we can count vertically as well. And remember, each of these ridges is 2 rows because it takes 2 rows to make 1 ridge in garter stitch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 ridges. So that would be 20 rows. 11 stitches and 20 rows in slip stitch pattern is the gauge for my pillow. So this tells me if I use size 13 needles, 9mm needles, and follow the instructions, my pillow cover will be the right size. If you get too many stitches, that means your needles are too small and you need to go up a needle size. If you get fewer stitches, that means your needles are too large and you need to use smaller needles. If you didn't get the exact gauge, go back and do another swatch with a different size needle so that you know that your pillow cover will be the right size. Keep the swatch because you are going to need some of the yarn from the swatch to complete your pillow. Now that I've confirmed my gauge, I can cast on for my pillow. And I want to leave a plenty long enough yarn tail to cast on my first row. I'll cast on a total of 35 stitches. You may wonder why we want it 13 inches square but it's a 14-inch pillow form. That's because we want to have a little bit of negative ease. We want the pillow cover to stretch just the tiniest bit as it fits over the pillow form. That will make for a better looking pillow. Here I have my one pillow form. I bound off at the top and left a tail, for nice long tail for weaving in later. I finished both my pillow pieces and I want to weave in my ends securely. I'm working on the wrong side of my fabric, going in and out, up and down, and then I'm going to go in a diagonal direction, up a few stitches, and then down a few stitches, and then up a few stitches again. There are many different ways to weave in ends. I've woven in my ends on one piece and one end on the other piece, and I have my working yarn still attached, although I did fasten off. Now it's time to put these two pieces together. If I like, I could just cut this yarn tail, leaving a nice long tail, and use it to sew the seams together, but I really prefer to crochet the edges together, so let's do that. I'm going to hold the front and back pieces with the wrong sides together. So I'm going to put wrong sides together and right sides are facing out. I may want to pin these or lock them together somehow. I'm just going to take one kind of large stitch marker here. It's a jumbo stitch marker, and put those corners together. But really we can see where we're going with this. So with wrong sides together, right sides out, I'm going to take my large crochet hook. This is a size MN or 9mm hook, and I'm just going to put it through the first stitch here, through both layers of the first stitch, and yarn over and pull up a loop. That's going to start my seam. Now I'm going to single crochet into that same space, and then as I look at the edge of my garter stitch, I can see that there's some bumps here, and then there's a space between the bumps, and I think I'm going to try working in the space between those bumps all the way down. We'll see whether that is the right number of stitches or the right rate of stitching along here. If it's not right, we'll go back, rip it out, and try it again. So here's my next bump, between bumps, I guess I should say. Go in, yarn over, pull up a loop, and yarn over, pull through two. We're doing a single crochet here. Go in through both layers and single crochet them together. I've done a few more stitches, and I'm looking at this with a discerning eye, and I can definitely see that it is not doing what I want it to do. This looks very pretty and very smooth, and that's fine, but look at what's happening over here on the corner. This tells me the fact that the edge of the piece is splaying out here or curving out means that this seam is getting to be too long. What that means is that working into every stitch along here has been too much for the size of this hook and the size of the yarn, that my single crochet gauge is wider than the gauge of every other row for my garter stitch. I'd rather have it look just right, so I'm going to pull this out and try it at a different rate. I'm going to go ahead and leave that first stitch in there. So before I was working into every pair between the bumps, the front layer and the back layer between the bumps. Now I'm going to skip one of those every now and then. So there I'm working between the two. I think I will not work there and work in this one. And maybe I'll skip about every fourth one. Let's see how that works. Let's stop and take a look. That is better. Can you see how the corner is staying nice and square here? So that just tells me I need to not work into every single pair, but skip one every now and then. But the other thing is, does that mean I'm going to have a hole that I'm unhappy with? I think this is going to be okay. This is pretty bulky yarn and it does leave a little bit of a hole, but I think it'll be all right once we put the pillow form in there. So I'm going to keep going at that rate until I get to this corner over here. I stop and take a look and I'm happy with the way that seam looks. Now that I'm at the corner, I'm going to put 2 or maybe 3 stitches right here in the corner stitch. So working through both layers. Normally we put 3 stitches, 3 single crochets in a corner, but I don't necessarily want this corner to be super pointy, and I'm going to see if I can get by with just putting 2 stitches in the corner. Now we're going to be working along this edge that's the cast on edge. And normally if we were doing seaming, we would want to work into every single stitch, but I know that my single crochet gauge is going to be wider than my knitting gauge was, which means I need to not work into every single stitch. However, I do want to make sure that I'm matching up my slip stitch ridges here. So as I work across, I'm going to want to make sure that I'm matching that front and back, and it may be that you want to pin those to make sure that they are matching up. I'm not going to take my own advice and pin them, so we'll see how well I do. So you want to go through both layers once again, and depending on what kind of cast on you use, that might be 2 loops of that cast on stitch. Here I am at my slip stitch ridge, and I want to make sure I'm going right into the slip stitch ridge on the other side too. I've worked across to the corner. I think that's looking pretty good and smooth, and I like the way it looked when I did 2 single crochets in the corner here to keep it from being too pointy. So I'm going to put 2 single crochets in the corner stitch right here. I'm going to turn it, rotate it, and now I'm just going to work along this edge at the same rate that I did the opposite edge over here. So if you'll remember, I think I did 3 stitches and then skipped 1, and I'm going to do the same thing here because I want my sides to be exactly the same length. I'm going to put 2 stitches in the corner just like I've been doing. Then I'm going to stop because I need to put my pillow form in before I finish. So I'm going to pull that yarn tail out here. And here comes the test. I've got my 14-inch pillow form from Fairfield, and it's got a little zipper here, and I'm going to put the zipper in first just to make things easier. Just stuff that pillow form right in there. And make sure the corners fill out. I want to get the corner of the pillow form into the corner of my pillow cover. And squish it in there a little bit. There we go. Now I can close up my final seam. I'm going to take my pin here and use it to hold these edges together a little bit so that I can make sure I'm still keeping my slip stitch ridges together. This is a little bit trickier when you get to this point. Now remember, I'm not working into every stitch. I'm going to work at the same rate that I did on the other side. And in this one, this is the bound off edge. So I might have to struggle a little bit to get under both loops of that bound off stitch. It was important to bind off loosely, and I maybe didn't bind off loosely enough, but it'll be okay. I'm going to skip that pair and work into this pair, making sure that I'm matching the ridge on the other side. Well, here's what real life looks like. I was hoping that I had enough yarn left to finish this seam without having to go into my swatch. At the beginning of the project, I made a nice big swatch, but I'm coming up just a little bit short, just a tiny little bit short. So I'm going to borrow from my swatch. And I was hoping I wouldn't have to do this, but I'm just going to take that piece out. I didn't weave in the ends, and use it to finish up this seam. I've done those last few stitches, and I put the last single crochet in the first corner stitch where I worked that first single crochet. So now I can pull out a little bit of strand here, cut my yarn, and I'm going to, instead of fastening off by pulling this yarn end through, I'm going to pull it through like this, which is not the normal way we fasten off, because at this point I want to thread my tapestry needle and finish the last stitch with an invisible join. So I'm going to have this yarn coming out of here. I've threaded my tapestry needle. I'm going to work around the V of the first stitch like this, and then I'm going to put my needle back down through that last stitch, down through the center, and you can see that that creates an invisible join around here. Now I have some ends to weave in. You see this stitch is a little bit big. That's because I have yarn tails here. It's a little trickier to do once you have the seams done, because you can't work on the inside, but I'm going to just work through some of those underneath, but it's not enough to just work underneath those single crochets. I don't want to pull that too tight. You don't want to just slide it under there. That's not sufficient. You want to go back at least in another direction, and I'm going to try to go underneath some stitches in the back here. I'm kind of feeling my way through these stitches on the wrong side. I can feel that I'm going under them, in and out. Another thing you can do if you want to have a sharp tapestry needle is actually split the stitches so that you're working through the stitch rather than under the stitch. So I really like to make sure that I am weaving in completely securely in there. I've gone through a stitch as well, and I will do that with these other ends here as well.
If you'd like more instruction like this, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Check out the links in the video notes for other ways you can find me. Thanks for watching.